I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
Snow had been falling steadily since tea time, transforming the grounds of Ashworth Hall into a pristine winter tableau that would have graced any Christmas card. The Georgian manor house glowed warmly against the darkening December sky, its tall windows casting golden rectangles across the white landscape. Inside, the great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Holly and ivy festooned the ancient oak beams, while a magnificent Norwegian spruce dominated the far end of the room, its branches heavy with 3 generations of family ornaments and twinkling with hundreds of electric fairy lights. Lady Margaret Ashworth moved through her guests with the practiced grace of a woman born to such occasions, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her burgundy silk gown a masterpiece of understated elegance. At 62, she remained the undisputed queen of county society, and tonight's Christmas Eve gathering represented the culmination of months of careful planning. The guest list had been selected with the precision of a military campaign, each name chosen to reflect the family's standing while ensuring the proper balance of entertainment and social obligation. Sir Edmund Ashworth, her husband of 37 years, held court near the blazing fireplace, his robust laughter punctuating conversations about the unseasonably heavy snowfall and its likely impact on Boxing Day's traditional hunt. A man who had built his fortune in railway investments, Sir Edmund possessed the confident bearing of one accustomed to having his opinions sought and his decisions respected. Tonight, however, there was an undercurrent of tension beneath his jovial exterior, a tightness around his eyes that suggested all was not entirely well in the Ashworth household. Their son, Captain James Ashworth, recently returned from India with his regiment, stood somewhat apart from the main gathering, his military bearing evident even in evening dress. The years of colonial service had left their mark, a certain wariness in his dark eyes, a habit of positioning himself where he could observe all entrances to the room. His wife, the former Miss Vivian Pembroke, clung to his arm with the desperate gaiety of a woman trying too hard to appear happy. Her frequent, brittle laughter rang out at inappropriate moments, drawing concerned glances from the other guests. Dr. Reginald Thornfield, the family physician and Sir Edmund's oldest friend, nursed a brandy while engaging in quiet conversation with Miss Cordelia Ashworth, Sir Edmund's unmarried sister. At 58, Miss Cordelia possessed the sharp intelligence and acerbic wit of a woman who had long ago abandoned any pretense of feminine delicacy. Her observations about their fellow guests were delivered with surgical precision, causing Dr. Thornfield to wince more than once at their accuracy. Near the Christmas tree, the Reverend Mr. Algernon Whitmore attempted to maintain a theological discussion with Mr. Geoffrey Harrington, the family solicitor, though the latter's attention seemed more focused on the considerable quantity of champagne being consumed than on matters of spiritual significance. Mr. Harrington, a thin, nervous man with prematurely grey hair, had the look of someone carrying an uncomfortable burden. His fingers drummed constantly against his champagne flute, and his eyes darted frequently toward Sir Edmund with an expression that might have been guilt or merely professional concern. The evening's most exotic addition was Madame Natasha Volkov, a Russian émigré whose claim to minor nobility was matched only by her talent for extracting generous donations for various charitable causes. Her dramatic black evening gown and elaborate diamond jewelry made her a focal point of attention, though whether this was entirely welcome remained unclear. She had attached herself to young Mr. Timothy Ashworth, Sir Edmund's nephew and heir presumptive, much to the visible displeasure of Miss Penelope Fairfax, the local squire's daughter who had long been considered Timothy's inevitable bride. As the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11:30, Lady Margaret called for attention. It was tradition at Ashworth Hall for the family to gather around the Christmas tree at the stroke of midnight, when Sir Edmund would ceremonially light the final candle, a beautiful silver candelabra that had belonged to his grandfather. The assembled guests moved closer to the magnificent tree, their voices dropping to the hushed tones appropriate for a moment of significance. Sir Edmund stepped forward, accepting the ornate silver lighter from his wife with a flourish. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "another year draws to its close, and we gather once again to celebrate the bonds of family and friendship that—" His words were cut short by a sudden, violent crash from somewhere deeper in the house, followed immediately by the sound of splintering glass. The guests turned as one toward the noise, their faces reflecting confusion and alarm. Before anyone could speak, the lights went out. The great hall plunged into absolute darkness, save for the flickering flames of the fireplace and the twinkling lights on the Christmas tree. In the sudden blackness, voices rose in concern and confusion. Lady Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. "Edmund! Edmund, where are you?" When the lights returned, perhaps 30 seconds later, though it seemed much longer, the scene had changed dramatically. Sir Edmund lay crumpled beneath the Christmas tree, his evening clothes disheveled, his face bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. Around his neck, twisted tight as a garrote, was a length of silver tinsel from the tree itself, its festive gleam now macabre in the restored light. Dr. Thornfield was the first to reach the fallen man, his medical training overriding the shock that had frozen the other guests. His examination was brief but thorough. "He's dead," he announced quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Strangled, and recently, within the last few minutes." Lady Margaret stood frozen, her hand still extended as if reaching for her husband. Miss Cordelia moved to support her sister-in-law, her usual sharp tongue stilled by the magnitude of the tragedy. Captain James stepped forward, his military training asserting itself as he began to take charge of the situation. "No one is to leave this room," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of years of command. "The doors are to remain closed until the police arrive." He looked around the circle of shocked faces, his expression grim. "Someone in this room is a murderer." The snow continued to fall outside, heavier now, sealing Ashworth Hall away from the outside world. The telephone lines, already unreliable due to the weather, would soon be discovered to be completely down. The nearest police station was 8 miles away along roads that were rapidly becoming impassable. By morning, when the storm finally cleared and help could arrive, a small Belgian gentleman with an egg-shaped head and magnificent moustache would receive an urgent telegram in London. But for now, in the warm glow of the Christmas tree lights, a killer walked among them, hidden behind a mask of shock and innocence. The festive gathering had become something far more sinister, a deadly game where the stakes were life and death, and where only the most meticulous of minds could hope to separate truth from deception. The corpse beneath the Christmas tree would soon become the centerpiece of a mystery that would test the limits of human psychology and the power of pure deduction. For in the morning, when local authorities proved inadequate to the task, the case would require the services of the one man whose little gray cells could penetrate the darkest corners of the human heart and illuminate the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of motive, opportunity, and carefully constructed lies. The silence that followed Dr. Thornfield's pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the whisper of snow against the tall windows. Lady Margaret remained frozen in her chair, her face drained of all color, while Miss Cordelia stood protectively beside her, one firm hand resting on her sister-in-law's shoulder. The transformation from festive celebration to crime scene had happened with such shocking swiftness that several guests still held their champagne glasses as if the normal world might somehow reassert itself. Captain James moved with the decisive efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. "Hargreaves," he called to the butler, who had appeared silently in the doorway, his usually impassive face betraying deep shock. "Secure all external doors immediately. No one enters or leaves the house. Send someone to check the telephone lines, though I suspect we'll find them down." The butler nodded and withdrew, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the corridor beyond. Dr. Thornfield rose slowly from beside Sir Edmund's body, his examination complete. The ligature was applied with considerable force, he said quietly, his professional demeanor intact despite the personal tragedy. Death would have been swift, but not instantaneous. There are no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. Either Sir Edmund was taken completely by surprise, or... He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The guests began to react in distinctly individual ways to their predicament. Mr. Harrington, the family solicitor, had retreated to a corner near the fireplace, his thin frame hunched over the briefcase he clutched protectively. His fingers drummed an incessant rhythm against the leather, and his eyes darted nervously between the covered body and the faces of the other guests. Whatever business had brought him here tonight with those mysterious papers now seemed to weigh upon him like a physical burden. Madame Volkov had abandoned her theatrical Russian accent and dramatic gestures entirely. She stood perfectly still near the Christmas tree, her dark eyes moving systematically from person to person with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew. Young Timothy Ashworth appeared genuinely bewildered, his boyish features etched with shock, while Miss Penelope Fairfax had withdrawn slightly from him, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Vivian Ashworth clung to her husband's arm with increasing desperation, her earlier brittle gaiety replaced by barely controlled hysteria. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice rising dangerously. "Trapped in here with a murderer." Captain James placed a steadying hand over hers, but his attention remained focused on the larger tactical situation. Hargreaves returned with grim news. The telephone lines were indeed down, brought low by the weight of ice and snow. The main road to Little Wickham had become completely impassable, with drifts reaching nearly to the first-floor windows on the north side of the house. "We are quite cut off, sir," the butler reported with characteristic understatement. "I doubt any assistance could reach us before morning, and perhaps not even then." Captain James nodded grimly. "Then we must manage on our own until help arrives. I propose we remain together in this room throughout the night. No one goes anywhere alone." He looked around the circle of faces, his expression stern but not unkind. Since the crime was committed in darkness, we must establish exactly where each person stood when the lights failed, not to accuse, but to create a clear record of events. The suggestion met with reluctant agreement, though several guests exchanged meaningful glances. As they began to position themselves as they had been at the moment of the murder, the Christmas tree loomed over them like a silent witness, its twinkling lights casting eerie shadows across the shrouded form beneath. The festive decorations that had seemed so cheerful hours before now appeared almost sinister in the changed atmosphere. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, sealing Ashworth Hall away from the world. By morning, when the first constable finally struggled through the snow-blocked lanes, word would reach London of a case requiring special expertise. A small Belgian gentleman with an international reputation for solving the impossible would soon receive an urgent summons, though for now the killer walked among them, hidden behind a mask of shock and innocence, secure in the knowledge that the storm provided perfect cover for the most carefully planned of crimes. The task of reconstructing their positions proved more revealing than Captain James had anticipated. As each guest attempted to recall their exact location during those crucial 30 seconds of darkness, a web of small contradictions began to emerge. Lady Margaret stood where she remembered being, directly opposite the Christmas tree, her hand still unconsciously extended as if holding the silver lighter she had been about to pass to her husband. Miss Cordelia positioned herself just behind her sister-in-law, confirming that she had remained motionless throughout the blackout, her sharp eyes having been trained on the assembled company even in darkness. Dr. Thornfield moved to his remembered position near the fireplace, but his account proved troubling. "I stepped forward when I heard the crash," he admitted, his medical instincts evident. "I thought someone might have been injured by falling glass or ornaments. I took perhaps 3 steps toward Edmund before the lights returned." This placed him considerably closer to the victim than his initial claim suggested. More disturbing still was Mr. Harrington's evident confusion about his own whereabouts. The solicitor had first claimed to be by the window, but when pressed to demonstrate, he found himself standing near the Christmas tree itself, within easy reach of the silver tinsel that had become the murder weapon. "I may have moved," he said nervously, his fingers drumming against his briefcase with increasing agitation. The darkness was so complete, and I heard Lady Margaret call out. Madame Volkov's positioning raised its own questions. She had claimed to be admiring ornaments on the far side of the tree, yet when she moved to demonstrate, she found herself directly behind where Sir Edmund had fallen. "There was movement to my left during the blackout," she said, her theatrical accent notably absent. "Someone passed very close, and I smelled tobacco. Coarse cigarettes, not a gentleman's blend." Timothy Ashworth frowned at this observation. "I smelled nothing but Christmas pine and candle wax. And I was standing right beside you, Madame Volkov." His contradiction was gentle but firm, creating yet another discrepancy in the growing list of inconsistencies. Captain James noted each contradiction with military precision, but it was Vivian's admission that proved most significant. When he stated quietly, "You did let go of my arm, Vivian." For a moment, the assembled guests drew a collective breath. His wife's face flushed crimson as she stammered, "The shock, I hardly knew. The darkness was so sudden." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Vivian had released her grip on her husband's arm, she too had been free to move during those crucial seconds. Her position near the tree, combined with her obvious distress, cast her in an entirely new light. It was then that Hargreaves returned with disturbing news. "The crash came from the morning room, sir," he reported to Captain James. "A Chinese vase had fallen and shattered. The window there shows signs of having been forced from the outside, though the snow has already covered any tracks that might have existed." He paused meaningfully. "However, upon closer examination, the window latch appears to have been opened from within. The forcing was theatrical, one might say." This revelation sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the winter storm. The suggestion of an outside intruder had provided some comfort, but if the window had been opened from inside, it meant the killer was indeed among them, and had gone to considerable lengths to create a false trail. Lady Margaret finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Edmund had been receiving letters," she said, her pale hands trembling slightly. "Anonymous letters that disturbed him greatly. He wouldn't share their contents, but he consulted Mr. Harrington about them just last week." All eyes turned to the solicitor, whose nervous drumming against his briefcase had become almost frantic. "Sir Edmund was being blackmailed," he admitted reluctantly. "Someone had uncovered irregularities in certain railway investments from his early business years. Nothing criminal, you understand, but potentially embarrassing if made public. The letters demanded substantial payments to ensure silence." Timothy stepped forward sharply. "Blackmail? But surely Uncle Edmund would never submit to such demands." "Indeed he would not," Mr. Harrington confirmed. "He was adamant about refusing to pay. That is why I brought the legal documents tonight, a codicil to his will that would have protected the estate from any scandal that might emerge posthumously." His voice dropped to barely audible levels. He was to sign them after the candle-lighting ceremony. The motive for murder was becoming clearer, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Who among them had knowledge of Sir Edmund's past business dealings? Who would benefit from preventing the signing of the codicil? And most puzzling of all, where was the silver lighter that Lady Margaret had handed to her husband mere moments before his death? Dr. Thornfield voiced this last question aloud. "The lighter should be near the body, yet we've found only this crushed ornament." He held up the damaged silver cherub that Hargreaves had discovered. "A man doesn't simply vanish a heavy silver lighter in the moment of his death." Miss Cordelia's sharp eyes fixed on each face in turn. "Unless," she said with characteristic bluntness, "someone removed it deliberately. The question is why a murderer would risk detection by lingering near the body to retrieve what should have been an insignificant object." The storm continued its relentless assault outside, but within the great hall, a different kind of tempest was brewing. Each revelation had tightened the net of suspicion around the assembled guests, and yet the truth remained tantalizingly out of reach. The missing lighter had become more than evidence. It was a puzzle piece whose significance would soon become apparent to a mind trained in the intricate psychology of crime. As the grandfather clock chimed 1 in the morning, none of them could have imagined that by dawn, a small Belgian gentleman with an egg-shaped head and magnificent mustache would be boarding the first available train north, summoned by a telegram that would describe this case as requiring the most delicate psychological analysis. The game was afoot, though the players had yet to realize they were being observed by a master of human nature whose little gray cells would soon illuminate every dark corner of their carefully constructed deceptions. The search for the missing lighter became Captain James's immediate priority, though he approached it with the methodical precision of a military operation rather than the frantic urgency that might have been expected. He assigned specific areas to each person present, ensuring that no corner of the great hall would remain unexamined, while maintaining his strict rule that no one should search alone. The Christmas tree itself, with its dense branches and countless ornaments, presented the most logical hiding place, yet also the most dangerous to investigate thoroughly. It was Miss Cordelia who first voiced what several others had begun to suspect. The killer had mere seconds to dispose of the weapon, she observed, her sharp eyes surveying the room with calculating precision. Panic would have caused them to simply drop it, but this was clearly planned. The lighter was hidden deliberately, which suggests the murderer remained remarkably composed even in those crucial moments after the deed. Dr. Thornfield, applying his medical knowledge to the crime, provided a disturbing insight into the murder method. A heavy silver lighter could serve as an effective tourniquet mechanism, he explained with clinical detachment. Wrapped in tinsel and twisted tight, it would require surprisingly little physical strength to achieve fatal results. The victim would lose consciousness within seconds, making any cry for help impossible. This revelation cast the crime in an entirely new light, particularly regarding the physical capabilities required. Vivian Ashworth, who had been quietly weeping in a corner chair, suddenly looked up with an expression of desperate resolve. "There's something I must tell you all," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "The reason Edmund was so concerned about the estate finances, the reason he needed that codicil signed tonight." Captain James moved protectively toward his wife, but she held up a restraining hand. "No, James. They must know the truth." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "I took money from Timothy's inheritance fund, nearly £3,000 over the past 2 years. James's medical treatments after his war injuries, the specialists in Switzerland. We couldn't afford them on a captain's pay, and I thought I could replace the money before anyone discovered the discrepancy." The confession hit the assembled guests like a physical blow. Timothy stared at his aunt in shock, while Lady Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her lips in dismay. Mr. Harrington's nervous drumming against his briefcase intensified to an almost frantic rhythm. "Uncle Edmund discovered the theft last month," Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "He was furious, not just about the money, but about the deception. The codicil Mr. Harrington brought tonight would have formally disinherited James, removing him from the line of succession entirely. The motive for murder was now starkly apparent, but it raised troubling questions about opportunity and method. Captain James's military bearing had never seemed more pronounced as he faced the implicit accusations in the room. "You're suggesting I helped murder my own uncle to protect an inheritance built on my wife's theft?" His voice carried a dangerous edge. "I may have disagreements with Edmund's methods, but I am not a killer." It was then that Hargreaves approached with the careful deference of a servant bearing unwelcome news. "Captain, sir, if I may direct your attention to the Christmas tree. I believe I have located the missing lighter." He reached carefully into the dense green branches, approximately at shoulder height, and withdrew the ornate silver object. Twisted around its base was a length of silver tinsel, and the entire surface bore the unmistakable signs of having been gripped with desperate force. Dr. Thornfield examined the improvised weapon with professional interest. "The mechanism is exactly as I suspected," he confirmed grimly. The tinsel was wound around the lighter and used to create a garrote of considerable efficiency. The killer would have needed only seconds to apply fatal pressure, then hide the evidence among the tree decorations. Madame Volkoff stepped closer to examine the recovered weapon, her theatrical manner completely abandoned in favor of sharp, analytical focus. "This placement required intimate knowledge of the tree's structure," she observed. "Someone who had spent considerable time studying the decorations, planning exactly where such an object could be concealed quickly and effectively." The implications were chilling. The murder had not been a crime of passion or opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated execution that had been planned well in advance. Someone in the room had studied the Christmas tree, selected the murder weapon, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. As the grandfather clock chimed 2 in the morning, the storm outside showed no signs of abating. The guests huddled closer to the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, each aware that they were trapped not just by the weather, but by the presence of a killer whose identity remained tantalizingly hidden among them. The discovery of the murder weapon had answered some questions, but it had raised far more disturbing ones about premeditation, planning, and the cold-blooded calculation required to execute such a crime. Unknown to them all, morning would bring more than just the end of the storm. It would bring a small Belgian gentleman whose reputation for solving the impossible would soon be put to its ultimate test in the drawing rooms and corridors of Ashworth Hall. The recovery of the murder weapon had shifted the atmosphere in the great hall from shocked confusion to pointed suspicion. Captain James found himself the subject of increasingly uncomfortable scrutiny, his military bearing and obvious physical capability making him a natural suspect for a crime requiring both planning and decisive execution. Yet it was precisely this obviousness that troubled Miss Cordelia, whose razor-sharp intellect had always been skeptical of simple solutions to complex problems. A soldier would never have chosen such an elaborate method, she observed quietly to Dr. Thornfield as they maintained their vigil by the dying fire. James would have used his hands, or perhaps that poker. This garrote business suggests someone with a more theatrical imagination. Her penetrating gaze moved meaningfully toward Madame Volkoff, who continued to examine the Christmas tree ornaments with suspicious intensity. The Russian woman seemed to sense the scrutiny and turned with a smile that failed to reach her calculating eyes. "You suspect me because I am foreign, yes? Because I have dramatic ways. But consider, I knew nothing of Sir Edmund's business troubles, nothing of family inheritances. What motive could I possibly have?" Her point was reasonable, yet it only deepened the mystery surrounding the carefully planned murder. Mr. Harrington, who had grown increasingly agitated since revealing the blackmail plot, suddenly spoke with nervous urgency. "There's something else you must know. Sir Edmund had been conducting his own investigation into the blackmail letters. He'd hired private detectives, traced their source." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The blackmailer was someone in this house tonight. This revelation struck the assembled guests like lightning. Lady Margaret rose from her chair with sudden energy, her grief temporarily overcome by indignation. Edmund bore this burden alone, protecting people who may not have deserved such consideration. She looked around the room with new eyes. One of you betrayed his trust, and when blackmail failed, murdered him to prevent exposure. As the hours crawled toward dawn, Madame Volkoff's earlier observation about the tobacco smell gained new significance. "Coarse cigarettes," she repeated thoughtfully. "Not Sir Edmund's fine cigars, nor Dr. Thornfield's pipe tobacco. Someone was smoking common cigarettes near the tree during those crucial moments." Miss Cordelia's skepticism about the mounting evidence against Vivian and Captain James grew more pronounced. "It is all too convenient," she declared. "The motive, the opportunity, the weapon found exactly where one might expect. It's almost as if someone wants us to believe this particular narrative." The storm outside began to subside as pale winter light crept across the snow-covered grounds. Just after 8 o'clock, a local sergeant arrived on foot, his mustache rimed with frost. After examining the scene with the grave sobriety of a country policeman faced with a sophisticated crime, he had the wisdom not to disturb the evidence. At Lady Margaret's urgent request, supported by Mr. Harrington's insistence on discretion, he agreed to contact Scotland Yard immediately. By 9:30, the telephone lines sputtered back to life. Hargreaves placed a call with the careful precision of a man summoning salvation itself. Mr. Harrington took the receiver with trembling hands and spoke an address in London, Whitehaven Mansions, as if invoking protection against chaos. The small, compact figure who stepped from the hired motor car shortly after 1 o'clock moved with fastidious precision, clearly offended that snow should dare interfere with proper order. Yet when Hercule Poirot entered the great hall and surveyed the scene, the fallen grandeur beneath the tree, the shrouded form, the tension-filled faces, his expression settled into attentive serenity. "You will permit, madame, that nothing be touched," he said to Lady Margaret, his voice precise and musical. "One makes the picture straight in the mind before one changes a single frame." He approached the Christmas tree, studying not the body but the surrounding branches, the weave of tinsel, the distribution of ornaments, his keen eyes fixed on the gap at shoulder height where the murder weapon had been concealed. This space, it is not the accident, it is prepared. When Lady Margaret mentioned the silver cherub ornament that had always occupied that spot, Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Always there, except when someone says to himself, "I will make the little shelf in the tree, at the right height, at the right side." His gaze moved to the fuse box across the hall. The lights failed after a crash. From the morning room, to create the moment of attention, and the moment after, the darkness. And in the dark, we are all equal, except the one who knows where he goes, what he does, how many steps. That one is not equal. That one is prepared. Poirot requested written accounts from each person, then asked Hargreaves a crucial question. "Who dressed the tree?" The butler's response confirmed that several people had access, including Miss Fairfax and Mrs. James Ashworth. After examining the staged morning-room window, Poirot returned to study the scene with growing certainty. Sir Edmund expected no sudden nearness from the person who approached him, he observed. It was not a stranger. His eyes moved systematically across each face. "We will talk one by one. Symmetry, you understand, is the friend of truth." Poirot established his interview headquarters in Sir Edmund's private study, arranging 2 chairs with mathematical precision before the leather-topped desk. His method was deceptively conversational, allowing each person to reveal themselves through their hesitations, their unconscious gestures, and the subtle inflections that betrayed hidden truths. He began with the Reverend Mr. Whitmore, whose pastoral concern masked a treasure trove of village observation. Sir Edmund had been deeply troubled these past months, the Reverend confided, settling his considerable bulk into the chair. Not merely by those anonymous letters, but by family disappointments. He spoke of trust betrayed by those closest to him. The Reverend's eyes grew distant with memory. Just last Sunday, he mentioned that the greatest sins are often committed by those who believe their motives pure. Miss Penelope Fairfax entered with controlled composure, her account precise and observant. "I noticed Mrs. James Ashworth adjusting ornaments on the tree earlier this evening," she revealed. "She seemed particularly concerned with their placement, moving several pieces to create better balance. At the time, I thought it merely feminine attention to detail." She paused meaningfully. Timothy was acting strangely tonight as well, distant, almost relieved when Madame Volkoff attached herself to him so obviously. Dr. Thornfield's interview revealed the complexity of friendship strained by moral compromise. Edmund discovered more than Vivian's theft, he admitted heavily. There had been systematic irregularities in the estate accounts for over 2 years. Someone with complete access and authority had been embezzling substantial sums. His professional detachment cracked slightly. Edmund planned to confront them tonight after the celebration. He wanted to offer one final chance for confession. This revelation transformed Poirot's understanding entirely. The blackmail, the staged break-in, even the choice of murder weapon, all were elements in a desperate attempt to prevent exposure by someone who had enjoyed Sir Edmund's complete trust. Mr. Harrington proved a bundle of raw nerves, wringing his hands throughout the interview. His fear led him to paint vivid pictures of Sir Edmund's supposed enemies, particularly a disgruntled former business partner who had recently returned to England. "That's the man you want," he insisted with vehement conviction. "Someone with a real grudge, real motive for revenge." Sergeant Davies, who had been listening from the corridor, nodded enthusiastically. "That's it then, isn't it, sir?" he whispered to Poirot confidentially. "An old enemy, a grudge, the blackmail. This mysterious blackmailer fellow must have snuck in during the party, waited for the lights to go out, and done the deed." Poirot merely stroked his magnificent moustache, his eyes twinkling with faint amusement. "Ah, the convenient enemy, Sergeant Davies. Always so obliging to appear precisely when needed. But tell me, was this former business partner invited to the Christmas Eve celebration? Did he know of the family traditions, the exact moment Sir Edmund would approach the tree?" The sergeant blinked, momentarily flummoxed. And how, pray tell, did this outsider know to open the morning room window from the inside? The question hung in the air, a tiny detail that shattered the sergeant's neat theory. Poirot understood that the most convincing lies were built on foundations of partial truth, and it was the small, inconvenient facts that always revealed the heart of deception. Returning to the great hall, Poirot examined the Christmas tree with renewed focus. Hargreaves confirmed that the silver cherub ornament, Sir Edmund's personal favourite, traditionally placed at shoulder height, had gone missing before dinner. "Sir Edmund always positioned it himself," Lady Margaret had said. "I assumed someone had moved it for cleaning." But Poirot saw the truth more clearly. The missing cherub had created the perfect hiding place for the murder weapon, a gap prepared with careful calculation by someone who knew the family traditions intimately. Near the tree's base, almost invisible against the patterned carpet, lay a pinhead dot of hardened wax, pale as old ivory. The candelabra had not yet been lit at midnight, yet someone had used candles earlier in their preparations. The person who dressed this tree, Poirot murmured to himself, who knew exactly where to create the hiding place. This same person possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Edmund's habits, his trust, his vulnerability. His eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. We begin to see the true picture. Not a crime of inheritance or passion, but something far more calculated. Someone who has been planning this moment for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity when all suspicion would fall elsewhere. The little Belgian detective straightened, his manner settling into the focused intensity that preceded revelation. Soon, very soon, the moment would come to gather all suspects and expose the truth hidden beneath their carefully constructed deceptions. Poirot's examination of Sir Edmund's private study yielded revelations that transformed the entire complexion of the case. With Lady Margaret's reluctant permission, he methodically reviewed the estate ledgers, his keen eyes detecting patterns that others had overlooked. The financial irregularities were more extensive than anyone had imagined. Systematic embezzlement spanning nearly 3 years, disguised through a sophisticated network of false charitable contributions and phantom accounts. Dr. Thornfield's reluctant confession added crucial urgency to the timeline. "Edmund was dying, Mr. Poirot," he admitted heavily, his professional composure finally cracking. His heart condition was terminal. Perhaps 6 months, certainly no more than a year. He insisted on absolute secrecy, wanting to settle his affairs without becoming an object of pity. This medical revelation explained the desperate timing of the murder. Someone had needed to silence Sir Edmund before he could expose their crimes and ensure justice from beyond the grave. The discovery of an unfinished letter in Sir Edmund's desk drawer confirmed this theory. Written in the deceased man's careful handwriting, it was addressed to Scotland Yard, requesting a discreet investigation into systematic theft by a person in whom I have placed complete trust. The letter remained unsigned, its completion prevented by murder. Poirot's next experiment proved particularly illuminating. "We will conduct a small test," he announced to the assembled household, requesting that the great hall be darkened once more. "Blindfolded, each of you will cross from the doorway and touch the place on the tree where you stood when the lights failed. You will move as you did that night, without thinking, following only instinct and memory." One by one they attempted the exercise. Miss Penelope counted too few steps and reached too high, her fingers brushing a paper star. Madame Volkoff extended her hand too low, misjudging the distance completely. Mr. Harrington fumbled and apologized to the furniture twice, clearly disoriented. But Timothy Ashworth moved with unnerving precision, gliding forward to touch the exact branch where the murder weapon had been concealed, his fingers finding the small ridge where the silver lighter had rested. "I helped hang the heavier ornaments," Timothy explained, flushing at the implications. "It's just where my hand remembers, that's all." Yet his accuracy was too perfect to be coincidental, suggesting intimate familiarity with the tree's structure that went beyond casual decoration. Returning to his methodical examination of physical evidence, Poirot drew attention to details others had missed. The pale drop of hardened wax near the tree's base told a story of careful preparation. "Someone used candles here before the formal ceremony," he observed. "The missing silver cherub ornament that traditionally occupied this space. It was removed, deliberately to create the perfect hiding place for the murder weapon." His interview with Mr. Harrington finally broke the solicitor's resistance. Confronted with evidence of the typed blackmail letters bearing the distinctive worn E and misaligned T of his office typewriter, Harrington collapsed entirely. "I had gambling debts," he whispered, "pressing creditors who wouldn't wait. I told myself I was only collecting what Sir Edmund owed to truth, but I never meant for it to lead to murder. I never touched him." Sergeant Davies moved to arrest Harrington with obvious satisfaction, but Poirot raised a restraining hand. "Non, mon ami. He is the blackmailer. Yes, but not the murderer. Observe. He seeks to guess at my thoughts rather than recall his own actions. A guilty man remembers every detail of his crime with terrible clarity." The planted cigarette stub beneath the morning room window provided further evidence of misdirection. The coarse tobacco, the theatrical staging of a break-in, even the convenient timing of its discovery, all were elements designed to point suspicion away from the true killer, someone who understood both the household dynamics and the psychology of criminal investigation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered grounds, Poirot prepared for the final gathering. The killer had constructed an elaborate web of false clues and misdirection, counting on confusion and multiple suspects to obscure their guilt. But the little grey cells had penetrated each layer of deception, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath the festive tragedy. Soon, very soon, the moment would come to expose the truth hidden behind the mask of innocence and grief. Poirot's next move demonstrated the psychological acuity that had made his reputation throughout Europe. Rather than immediately confronting his growing suspicions, he chose to apply subtle pressure through what appeared to be casual arrangements. He requested that Sir Edmund's study remain accessible, with the recovered ledgers and the unfinished letter to Scotland Yard prominently displayed on the desk. "For the comfort of troubled consciences," he explained to Lady Margaret with characteristic delicacy, though his keen eyes suggested a more calculated purpose. The household endured a tense afternoon meal in the morning room, where the swept remnants of the shattered Chinese vase served as a constant reminder of the previous night's violence. Conversation remained stilted and artificial, each person lost in private anxieties while maintaining the facade of civilized behavior. Miss Cordelia observed the gathering with her customary sharpness, noting how Timothy's usual appetite had completely disappeared and how his hands trembled slightly when reaching for his teacup. Poirot moved through the afternoon with deceptive casualness, engaging in seemingly innocent conversations while his trained eye catalogued every nervous gesture and telling detail. He noticed the faint smear of soot along Mr. Harrington's cuff that had not been present earlier, the way Madame Volkov's fingers bore the lingering scent of tobacco despite her claims of abstinence, and, most significantly, the controlled calm that Lady Margaret maintained with what seemed almost superhuman effort. As twilight approached, bringing with it the bitter cold that penetrated even the well-heated rooms of Ashworth Hall, Poirot excused himself ostensibly to dress for dinner. In reality, he had earlier removed the genuine documents to a secure location, leaving only blank papers weighted by a pewter inkwell on Sir Edmund's desk. The trap was set with characteristic precision, baited with the very evidence that someone desperately needed to destroy. The first hint of smoke came not as an alarm, but as a quiet observation from Hargreaves, who appeared in the morning-room doorway with his usual understated dignity. "If you please, madam," he said simply, and Lady Margaret rose immediately, understanding the implications before the others. They emerged into the corridor to see wisps of smoke curling from beneath the study door, and Sergeant Davies immediately threw it wide to reveal a carefully controlled fire crackling in the wastebasket. Timothy moved with surprising efficiency to smother the flames with a hearth rug, while Poirot calmly closed a window that had been opened precisely half an inch to provide the necessary draught. The fire had been set with methodical care rather than desperate panic, and the faint smell of paraffin mingled with something sweeter that did not belong to ordinary paper or ink. Among the ashes, Poirot's trained eye detected a tiny sparkle no larger than a fish scale. He retrieved it with delicate precision, a curved sliver of bright metal twisted into a microscopic hook, clearly the detachable wire from a Christmas ornament designed to hang something heavier than ordinary baubles. Near the grate lay a small, tear-shaped droplet of fused silver, confirming his growing certainty about the crime's true nature. Sergeant Davies moved to arrest Harrington with obvious satisfaction, but Poirot's gentle intervention revealed the deeper truth. Lifting the pewter inkwell, he exposed 4 clean rectangles where papers had protected the desk from dust. "Observe, mon ami. Someone believed these papers dangerous, yet there is nothing to them. The window was opened for draught and to suggest escape, but there are no footprints in the crusted snow outside because no flight occurred." The brass key that Hargreaves discovered bore traces of scarlet sealing wax, the distinctive color that Lady Margaret used for her personal correspondence. Yet, when Poirot examined the scorched desk edge, he found something far more damning. A thumbprint pressed into the softened wax, delicate and tapered, with a tiny nick where a nail had been clipped too close. As the household gathered once more in the great hall for what they sensed would be the final confrontation, Poirot positioned himself with mathematical precision at the foot of the Christmas tree. The festive decorations that had seemed so cheerful 2 nights before now appeared almost sinister in the changed atmosphere, their twinkling lights casting eerie shadows across the assembled faces. With grave ceremony, Poirot hung the tiny wire hook on a low branch, watching carefully as several faces flinched at this symbolic gesture. He observed them all with courteous but merciless attention, his manner suggesting that the moment of revelation was finally at hand. The killer had returned to destroy evidence that existed only in their guilty imagination, but in doing so, they had provided the final proof that Hercule Poirot's little grey cells required. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between truth and deception, where the most meticulous mind in criminal investigation would finally expose the carefully hidden guilt that lurked beneath the mask of Christmas innocence. Poirot arranged the chairs in the great hall with mathematical precision, ensuring each person sat exactly where they had stood during the fatal moment 2 nights before. The Christmas tree loomed behind him like a silent witness, its twinkling lights casting shifting shadows across faces that bore the strain of prolonged suspicion and fear. The little Belgian detective moved with characteristic deliberation, his keen eyes cataloguing every nervous gesture, every telling detail that betrayed the thoughts his suspects sought to conceal. "Mes amis," he began, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had unraveled countless mysteries. "We have spent much time examining the physical evidence of this crime. The silver lighter, the tinsel garrote, the staged window in the morning room. But physical evidence, it tells us only what happened. To understand why, and more importantly who, we must examine the psychology of murder itself." He gestured toward the Christmas tree with characteristic eloquence. This crime was not born of sudden passion or desperate impulse. It was planned with the precision of a military campaign, executed by someone who understood not merely the household routines, but the very psychology of suspicion itself. The killer knew that obvious motives would create obvious suspects, and used this knowledge to construct an elaborate maze of misdirection. Moving to stand beside the tree, Poirot traced the branch where the murder weapon had been concealed. The missing silver cherub ornament, removed weeks before the crime, not on the fatal night. Someone with unlimited access to this house, someone whose presence in any room would never be questioned, prepared this hiding place with infinite patience. They understood Sir Edmund's habits, his Christmas traditions, the exact moment when he would approach the tree with trusting vulnerability. His penetrating gaze moved systematically across each face. The blackmail letters served a double purpose. Yes, Mr. Harrington's gambling debts provided genuine desperation, but they also created the perfect smoke screen for someone else's more deadly intentions. The true embezzler allowed these debts to continue, knowing they would create an ideal scapegoat when exposure became inevitable. Lady Margaret sat with rigid composure, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Miss Cordelia watched the proceedings with the sharp attention of a mind that had already begun to perceive the truth. Captain James shifted uncomfortably, his military bearing unable to mask his growing confusion at the direction of Poirot's reasoning. "The financial records reveal systematic theft spanning 3 years," Poirot continued with relentless precision. "Not the desperate grabbings of a blackmailer, but the careful, methodical embezzlement of someone with complete authority over estate transactions. Someone whose signature was never questioned, whose access was absolute, whose youth and apparent innocence deflected all suspicion." Timothy Ashworth had grown increasingly pale as the deduction proceeded, his boyish features drawn with something approaching terror. The transformation from confused heir to cornered suspect was becoming unmistakably clear to everyone present. "But the psychology of this crime runs deeper still," Poirot observed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The killer understood that Sir Edmund's terminal illness, known only to Dr. Thornfield and carefully concealed from the family, created an urgent timeline. There would be executors, final accountings, investigations that would inevitably uncover years of careful theft." He displayed the tiny wire hook recovered from the study fire, holding it up to catch the flickering light. This small piece of evidence tells us much about the murderer's character. It was designed to hang something heavy on the Christmas tree. Not an ordinary ornament, but the murder weapon itself. The preparation required intimate knowledge of the tree's structure, careful testing of weight and balance, the kind of familiarity that comes only from direct involvement in the holiday preparations. Miss Penelope's earlier observation about Timothy's careful attention to ornament placement now carried devastating significance. His ability to navigate the darkened room with perfect precision, his exact positioning during the reconstruction, his detailed knowledge of every branch and decoration, all pointed to careful preparation and guilty knowledge. The cigarette stub beneath the morning room window was planted to suggest an intruder, Poirot continued, but the choice of tobacco revealed the killer's inexperience with deception. Common cigarettes from the kitchen staff, not the refined tobacco that any genuine outsider would have smoked. And the window itself, forced from outside after being opened from within, creating the illusion of entry while providing an escape route that was never used. Timothy's composure began to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. His hands trembled visibly as he gripped the arms of his chair, and his eyes darted desperately around the room as if seeking some avenue of escape that did not exist. "The fire in the study was your final mistake," Poirot observed with clinical detachment. "You believed the unfinished letter contained specific evidence of your guilt, but it held only Sir Edmund's general suspicions about financial irregularities. Your attempt to destroy non-existent evidence provided the final proof of your culpability." The room fell into profound silence, broken only by the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. Every eye was fixed on Timothy, whose boyish face had crumpled with the weight of exposure and impending doom. Poirot straightened, his manner settling into the focused intensity that preceded final revelation. "Tomorrow, when the roads are clear and proper authorities can arrive, there will be formal charges and legal proceedings. But tonight, in this room where the crime was committed, truth has finally emerged from beneath the layers of deception and misdirection." The Christmas tree stood sentinel over the scene, its festive decorations now forever tainted by their association with murder. The killer had been identified through the inexorable logic of psychological deduction, but the final confrontation, the moment when guilt would be formally acknowledged and justice would be served, awaited the dawn of a new day. The weight of Poirot's methodical exposition settled over the great hall like a suffocating blanket. Timothy Ashworth sat frozen in his chair, his boyish features transformed by the terrible recognition that his carefully constructed facade had been systematically dismantled. The Christmas tree behind Poirot seemed to loom larger in the flickering firelight, its festive decorations now forever tainted by their association with calculated murder. "Monsieur Timothy," Poirot continued with gentle inexorability, "your performance has been admirable, truly." The bewildered nephew, shocked by tragedy, concerned for his family. But the little grey cells, they perceive a different truth beneath this careful construction. His voice carried the patient authority of a confessor who had heard every variation of human weakness. "You knew of Sir Edmund's terminal condition through your intimate access to family affairs. You understood that his death would bring executors, auditors, investigations that would inevitably expose 3 years of systematic embezzlement." Timothy's hands began to tremble visibly as he gripped the arms of his chair. The transformation from apparent victim to exposed killer was becoming undeniably clear to everyone present, yet still he struggled against the inevitable revelation. The codicil Mr. Harrington brought that night was not merely to disinherit Captain James for his wife's theft, Poirot observed, his keen eyes never leaving Timothy's face. It was to protect the estate from far more extensive financial irregularities that you had orchestrated with methodical precision. Sir Edmund was not merely confronting a blackmailer. He was about to expose the thief closest to him, the nephew he had trusted above all others. Lady Margaret pressed her handkerchief to her lips, her face draining of colour as the full implications became clear. Miss Cordelia's sharp intake of breath cut through the tense silence, while Captain James stared at his cousin with dawning horror and disbelief. "You needed to act quickly," Poirot continued relentlessly. "Christmas Eve provided the perfect stage. The family tradition of gathering around the tree, the exact moment Sir Edmund would stand vulnerable, distracted by ritual. You knew his habits, his movements, the precise position he would occupy, and you prepared with meticulous care." Timothy's composure finally began to crack under the sustained psychological pressure. "You don't understand," he burst out, his voice breaking with desperate emotion. "Uncle Edmund was dying anyway, 6 months, maybe less. What difference did it make if he died now rather than later? The estate would have been mine eventually. I was the natural heir, the logical successor. The callous calculation behind these words sent a collective shudder through the assembled company. Even Captain James, hardened by years of military service, recoiled at the cold-blooded rationalization of murder. "The difference," Poirot replied with quiet dignity, "is that Sir Edmund deserved to die with honor, surrounded by family who loved him, not strangled like a common criminal by the nephew he had nurtured and trusted. You robbed him not merely of life, but of the peaceful death he had earned through decades of honorable service." As the psychological dam burst, Timothy's confession poured forth with manic energy. The embezzlement began small, a few £100 here and there, always with the intention of replacement. But Uncle Edmund's trust was so complete, so absolute. He never questioned my signatures on estate documents, never doubted my explanations of charitable contributions and investment adjustments. The opportunities grew larger, and my needs became more pressing. Poirot listened with the patient attention of one who understood that complete revelation was psychologically inevitable once the first barriers fell. And when the blackmail scheme began, you saw the perfect opportunity to deflect suspicion while eliminating the only witness who could destroy you. "I had no choice," Timothy continued, his hands shaking as he ran them through his disheveled hair. "The thought of prison, of disgrace, of losing everything I had worked for, it became unbearable. When Harrington's desperation created the blackmail plot, I realized I could use it as cover for something far more permanent. The methodical nature of his planning emerged through continued confession. The missing cherub ornament had been removed weeks earlier during routine holiday preparations, creating the perfect concealment for the murder weapon. He had tested the weight and balance repeatedly, ensuring the silver lighter could be hidden and retrieved within seconds during the crucial moments of darkness. "Your precision during my blindfolded test revealed the truth," Poirot observed with clinical detachment. "It was not merely memory, but the unerring recall of a man who had rehearsed his actions countless times. You knew the exact branch, the exact height, because you had planned every detail with murderous calculation." Miss Penelope shrank away from the young man she had once expected to marry, her face reflecting the horror of recognizing a stranger behind familiar features. The Timothy she had known was revealed as a carefully constructed mask, concealing depths of greed and cold-blooded determination. "The morning room window was prepared as misdirection," Timothy admitted with twisted pride. "Opened from within and then forced from outside to suggest an intruder's escape route that was never used. The cigarette stub was inspired. I knew it would point suspicion toward the servants or an outsider, and the timing was perfect. Uncle Edmund always approached the tree at exactly midnight for the candle-lighting ceremony. All I needed was 30 seconds of darkness and the nerve to act. Sergeant Davies stepped forward with obvious intention, but Poirot gestured for patience. The psychological moment required complete resolution before justice could be served. "But you made critical errors," Poirot observed. "Your attempt to destroy evidence in the study fire revealed knowledge that only the killer could possess. The tiny wire hook recovered from the ashes bore traces of melted silver from the cherub you destroyed in panic. You believed the papers contained specific evidence of your crimes, but they held only Sir Edmund's general suspicions. Your guilty conscience created the very proof that condemned you." Timothy's defiance collapsed into desperate pleading. If Uncle Edmund had simply trusted me to handle the estate affairs without interference, none of this would have been necessary. His rigid morality, his insistence on absolute honesty, it left me no alternative. "There is always choice," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "Between honor and dishonor, between truth and deception, between life and death. You chose poorly at every crucial moment, and now you must face the consequences of those choices." As Sergeant Davies finally stepped forward with handcuffs, Timothy's last vestige of composure disappeared entirely. The young man, who had seemed the embodiment of English respectability, was revealed as a calculating killer whose charm and apparent innocence had concealed depths of murderous betrayal. The Christmas tree stood witness to his final humiliation, its twinkling lights casting shadows across a scene that would forever haunt the memories of those who witnessed it. The moment of justice had arrived, though the psychological wounds inflicted by Timothy's betrayal would require far longer to heal than the physical evidence of his crimes. Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision, his little grey cells having once again illuminated the darkest corners of human nature and exposed the truth hidden beneath layers of deception and false innocence. The weight of Timothy's confession settled over the great hall like a shroud, broken only by Lady Margaret's stifled sob and the steady tick of the grandfather clock, marking the passage of this terrible night into an equally terrible dawn. Sergeant Davies stepped forward with professional gravity, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing with chilling finality against the festive backdrop of twinkling Christmas lights. Timothy offered no resistance, his boyish face crumpled with the devastating recognition that his carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered as the sergeant led him toward the door, his voice carrying the hollow desperation of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Uncle Edmund was dying anyway. What difference did a few months make? The callous calculation behind these final words sent a collective shudder through the assembled company, the last vestige of sympathy extinguished by his complete inability to comprehend the magnitude of his betrayal. As the police motor car disappeared down the snow-covered lane with its grim cargo, the dawn light filtering through the tall windows began to transform the scene of tragedy. The Christmas tree, which had loomed so ominously throughout the investigation, now appeared somehow diminished in the pale morning light, its decorations rendered pathetic rather than sinister by the revelations of the mundane greed that had motivated such elaborate murder. Poirot remained by the windows, his compact figure silhouetted against the pristine landscape, watching until the vehicle vanished entirely from view. "The psychology of murder," he murmured to the assembled household, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar revelations. "It is always more complex than the simple mechanics of death. Timothy Ashworth did not merely kill his uncle. He murdered the very concept of family trust, destroyed bonds that had held 3 generations of honorable tradition together." The full scope of Timothy's betrayal emerged through the methodical examination of recovered documents. Over 3 years, he had systematically diverted nearly £15,000 through fictitious charitable contributions and phantom investment schemes, his position as heir presumptive providing perfect cover for increasingly audacious theft. Mr. Harrington's blackmail scheme had been orchestrated entirely at Timothy's instigation, using the solicitor's gambling debts as leverage to create the perfect smokescreen for far more serious crimes. Dr. Thornfield's revelation about Sir Edmund's terminal diagnosis provided the final piece of the psychological puzzle. Timothy's discovery of his uncle's approaching death had created an urgent timeline that transformed careful embezzlement into desperate murder. He couldn't risk the executors discovering his theft, Poirot explained with clinical precision. Sir Edmund's natural death would have brought the same investigations, but without the protective confusion of family tragedy and multiple suspects. The missing silver cherub ornament was eventually discovered in Timothy's bedroom, crushed beyond recognition in what appeared to have been a moment of panic following the murder. Its destruction had been entirely unnecessary. The ornament bore no incriminating evidence, but guilt had driven Timothy to eliminate even the most innocent reminders of his crime. Lady Margaret emerged from her shock with the dignity that had sustained her through decades of social responsibility, though the devastating blow to her family's reputation was evident in every line of her face. Edmund believed deeply in the power of truth to overcome deception, she said quietly to Poirot, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had lost not merely a husband, but the certainty that those closest to her could be trusted absolutely. Miss Penelope Fairfax departed Ashworth Hall that afternoon, her engagement to Timothy dissolved by mutual agreement that required no explanation. Her final words to Poirot carried the bitter wisdom of painful experience. "I thought I knew him completely. We had been friends since childhood, planned our future together for years, yet the man I believed I loved was nothing more than an elaborate performance, concealing depths of calculation I never suspected." Captain James and his wife prepared for their own inevitable departure, the revelation of Timothy's guilt providing cold comfort for their own financial disgrace. The inheritance that might have restored their fortunes was now forever tainted by association with murder, leaving them to face an uncertain future with whatever dignity they could salvage from the wreckage of family honor. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered grounds, Poirot prepared for his own departure. His work at Ashworth Hall was complete. Justice had been served, truth had been illuminated through patient application of logic and psychological insight. Yet the victory felt hollow, as it always did when the criminal proved to be someone who had enjoyed trust and affection from their victims. The Christmas decorations would be removed the following day, the tree consigned to a bonfire that would erase the physical reminders of tragedy. But the psychological scars would endure far longer, a permanent reminder that evil could flourish behind the most innocent facades, nurtured by opportunity and protected by the very trust it ultimately betrayed. In his leather notebook, Poirot made a final entry with characteristic precision. The Ashworth case, murder committed not from passion, but from calculation. Victim, Sir Edmund Ashworth. Perpetrator, nephew Timothy, motivated by greed and desperation to conceal systematic embezzlement. Method, strangulation with improvised garrote during orchestrated moment of darkness. Resolution, confession obtained through psychological pressure and irrefutable physical evidence. Justice served, though at terrible cost to surviving family members. As his motor car pulled away from Ashworth Hall, Poirot reflected on the eternal paradox of his profession. The little grey cells could illuminate the darkest corners of human nature, expose the most carefully hidden guilt, and ensure that justice prevailed over deception. Yet each victory came at the cost of innocence lost, trust shattered, and families destroyed by revelations too terrible to bear. The snow continued to fall as London drew nearer, covering the countryside in pristine white that would soon be marked by the tracks of ordinary life resuming its course. But for those who had witnessed the events beneath the Christmas tree, the holiday would never again carry simple joy. They had learned that evil announces itself not with dramatic flourishes, but by hiding behind the faces of those we love and trust most completely. Some truths, once revealed, could never be forgotten, and some betrayals cut too deeply to heal entirely. The little grey cell had triumphed once again, but victory in such cases always carried the bitter taste of human weakness exposed and innocence forever lost. The corpse beneath the Christmas tree had claimed more than one life. It had murdered the comfortable illusion that family bonds could transcend the corrupting power of greed and desperation. Hercule Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision and gazed out at the passing landscape, already preparing his mind for whatever new mysteries awaited in the great city ahead. The case was closed, but the memory would linger. Another reminder that in the labyrinth of human nature, the most dangerous monsters often wear the most familiar faces.